Today's lesson is Unit 1, Chemistry of Life, and this is part 1 of that particular unit, the structure of water and hydrogen bonding. Chemical bonds. The bonding properties depend on the number of valence shell electrons. Recall from chemistry that valence means outer, that is the outermost shell of electrons. Some atoms will lose electrons to empty its valence shell, as pictured up here, and others will gain electrons to fill that valence shell. That creates an ionic bond. If there's only one electron, for example, in the outer shell like this one had, this one only has one missing, it is very likely that this atom is going to just donate its electron, and that creates a positive or negatively charged atom. And if it loses electrons and it creates a positive ion, that is called a cation. And if it has a negative charge because it has gained electrons, like this one over here, that's an anion. Other times, depending on what molecules it is you're talking about, what atoms, the electrons will be shared. That creates a covalent bond, like here, where they are physically linked together because they are sharing particular electrons to complete their outer shells. There are two types of covalent bonds. One of them is nonpolar. And in a nonpolar covalent bond, the electrons are shared equally between the two, as in these two oxygen atoms over here. They are equally sharing those two, and they both have the same charge. The other type is a polar covalent bond, which we're going to talk about this quite a bit in this particular section. Electrons are shared unequally between the two different atoms that are participating in the particular covalent bond. Examples are when carbon and hydrogen are bonded together. The carbon has more protons to start with, so it tends to hog some of the electrons, and then the hydrogens end up without those particular electrons. And the same thing happens with water molecules. Oxygen is such a bigger molecule, and it has more protons to start with, that it ends up taking more of the electrons that are being shared with the hydrogens. So the oxygen ends up with a partial charge, and the hydrogens end up with a partial charge. So water is the polar molecule that we will talk about the most in this class. The oxygen atom, as I explained a minute ago, has so many more protons, so it pulls the electrons away from the hydrogens, and you end up with the oxygen side being slightly negative in charge because it has taken more electrons. And because the hydrogens end up without any electrons really, those have a positive charge, a slightly positive charge. So that's the water molecule and how it shares those electrons unevenly. Because of this uneven sharing, because of the polarity, it's called, of water molecules are attracted to each other because of those partial charges. So when you take two water molecules, you have the slightly positive end over here with this hydrogen, and the slightly negative end of this other water molecule here, and they create this temporary little attraction towards each other as a result of the partial positive and the partial negative charge here, and that is what's called a hydrogen bond. Okay? It is not a covalent bond. Okay? The covalent bond is what holds the actual one water molecule together, the oxygen and the two hydrogens. But when you have water molecule number 1 and water molecule number 2, when they are next to each other, they create this very weak attraction towards each other called a hydrogen bond. And you can see as you add more water molecules, so we have 1, 2, 3 water molecules now, you can see that multiple hydrogen bonds would be formed between those. The polarity of water leads to a number of very special properties that water has. And the first one that we're going to talk about is the specific heat of water. Specific heat is the amount of heat a substance must absorb in order to increase it by 1 degree Celsius in temperature. Water has a very high specific heat, so it resists temperature change. This is very important on our planet because large bodies of water resist temperature changes and they provide a stable environment for the organisms that live in them. In addition to that, they tend to moderate the climate of the nearby land. So if you look up here in this diagram in the corner, you can see that the temperature near the ocean is in the 70s, but as you move further away from the water, it gets to be in the hundreds. The same thing happens here in Connecticut. If you look at this particular weather map, you can see that inland, up here near where we are, it's 92 degrees, but down here on the coastline, it's only 79 degrees. Okay? The opposite happens in the wintertime. In the wintertime, it's colder here where we are, and it's warmer down at the shoreline. And that has to do with the water holding on to the heat, holding on to the warmer temperatures that were residual from the summer. And then the same thing here. In the summertime, you have residual coolness in the water left over from the winter and the spring. So the shoreline temperatures end up being cooler. Another property of water are cohesion and adhesion. Cohesion is when water molecules stick to each other, and adhesion is when water molecules stick to some other kind of substance. In nature, we see these as one of these as surface tension. So up here, where you have this insect that is able to kind of walk on top of the water, because those water molecules have created this strong surface almost because they are stuck together, they're stuck to each other, it allows some organisms to be able to walk on top of that. You can also see surface tension when you fill a glass of water all the way to the rim. It'll actually create a bubble at the top of the cup. So if that's your glass and you fill it with water, you can actually see that the water will slightly extend over the surface of the particular cup. Another thing in nature that is derived from the properties of cohesion and adhesion is something called transpirational pull. This is how water goes into the roots and travels all the way up and evaporates out eventually out of the leaves. This is how water travels upward inside plants, and it is because of the properties of cohesion and adhesion. Water molecules stick together, so as one water molecule exits at the top, another water molecule gets pulled in at the bottom because the one that was here at the bottom has now moved up a little bit and they're all stuck together. It's a little chain reaction that happens. This is also what happens inside a straw. You have capillary action. So you have the movement of water in a small tube or vessel, and it's allowed to go against the force of gravity. The density of water is another very unique property. Water in a liquid state is constantly moving around. So that means that those hydrogen bonds are constantly breaking and reforming. But when water is in a solid state, like ice, those hydrogen bonds are locked in place and they are fixed, and there's actually more space between those molecules. As a result of that, ice floats. Ice is less dense than liquid water. And this is super important for fish and other aquatic animals to survive in the wintertime. If ice sunk to the bottom, where would all the fish and the frogs and things that live in bodies of water go in the wintertime? So it actually creates kind of an insulating surface on the top. It protects them from wind, and it keeps the water underneath warmer in the wintertime. And another benefit of this is in the springtime when all that melting ice starts to sink down to the bottom, you get an overturn of nutrients and oxygen, and it's very beneficial to the organisms and the overall health of a body of water to have that mixing. So here's just another picture of those bonds locked in when it's frozen, when it's solid, versus here where they're breaking and reforming and it's constantly moving around. And another property of water is that it is a universal solvent, which means that it is able to easily dissolve other molecules. Because it has a partial positive and a partial negative charge, it will be able to take ions, like the ions here that make up salt, sodium chloride, and it's able to wrap itself around each of those molecules, and it's able to dissolve that in the water. It also happens with some larger molecules inside the body. Lysozyme is the example here. That's what that big purple molecule is. We will learn more about some of those enzymes and proteins in a later section. But for now, you need to know that water is the universal solvent. The dissociation of water molecules creates acidic and basic solutions. So when those molecules dissolve, when water dissolves certain molecules, sometimes it's going to release an abundance of hydrogen ions, which makes an acidic solution. If there is a balance between hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions, you get a neutral solution. And if there are more hydroxides than there are hydrogens, you end up with a base or an alkaline substance. And you can see the pH scale over there on the side. That is it for this particular section.